Harold was an elderly man living in a small riverside town where time seemed to move slower than in the rest of the world. He had no close family. But his life was not lacking in warmth or meaning. Every morning, Harold woke up in his quaint little house, where he had lived for most of his life. He opened the window to let the gentle sunlight pour into the room and took a deep breath of the fresh morning air. After a simple preparation, Harold walked down the road to the small cafe near his house, a place he considered his second home. The cafe sat at the corner of the street, surrounded by old oak trees providing shade. Inside, the cozy space was filled with neatly arranged wooden tables and chairs, with the aroma of coffee wafting through the air. Harold always chose a small table by the window, where he could watch the peaceful street life unfold. The cafe staff all knew him well and greeted him with warm smiles. They were familiar with Harold's preferences: a black coffee without sugar and a soft muffin scented with cinnamon. However, the most special part of Harold's morning routine wasn't the coffee or the muffin, it was the presence of a gray and white stray cat. This cat had appeared at the cafe one day, though no one could quite remember when, and quickly became a beloved fixture among the staff and customers. But out of everyone, Harold was the one the cat bonded with most. When Harold sat down, the cat often jumped onto the chair beside him or curled up at his feet, its bright green eyes exuding tranquility. Harold always shared part of his breakfast with the cat, gently breaking off a piece of his muffin. He placed it on a plate and slid it toward the cat. The cat nibbled with delight, occasionally looking up at Harold as if to say thank you. Harold couldn't explain why he felt such a strong connection to this cat, but its presence brought him joy and companionship. Perhaps in his quiet life, Harold found in the cat a kindred spirit who didn't need words to communicate. Not only Harold but also the regulars at the cafe often talked about the cat. They gave it various names, from Snowball for its white fur to Smokey for its gray patches. But Harold simply called it Little Friend. He didn't need a fancy name for a companion he already considered dear. On rainy days, Harold would bring a small towel to dry its fur. He even knitted a little sweater for it in winter, though the cat rarely kept it on for long. Each day at the cafe, Harold not only chatted with the cat but also with his familiar neighbors. They often asked each other about their lives, sharing small stories that meant the world to them. Once, Harold told everyone that he had been a sailor who traveled to many places but eventually chose to return to this small town. Some joked that Harold was the best storyteller in the cafe. Harold would only smile gently, saying his stories became interesting simply because there were people willing to listen. Not every day passed peacefully, though. Once, the cat suddenly disappeared for 3 days. Harold and the cafe regulars grew worried. Harold even roamed the town searching for it, carrying pieces of its favorite muffin. Finally, on the 4th day, the cat reappeared, thinner and with dirtier fur. Harold gently picked it up, checking for injuries. He spent the entire morning caring for the cat. And from that day forward, their bond grew even stronger. Harold didn't know how much longer his life would last, but he cherished every day he could visit the cafe, drink his familiar coffee, savor the fragrant muffin, and share peaceful moments with the gray and white cat. To him, such simple joys were complete happiness. A major storm was forecast to hit by the weekend. The weather reports warned of strong winds and heavy rain. But no one in the small riverside town seemed overly concerned. This wasn't the first time the town had faced bad weather, and its residents were accustomed to preparing for the rainy season. However, no one could have anticipated that this storm would bring an unprecedented disaster. That morning, Harold went to the cafe as usual. The sky was overcast, and the wind blew stronger than normal. Still, Harold felt at ease sitting at his usual table, enjoying his hot coffee and muffin while the gray and white cat curled up under the table at his feet. Other regulars at the cafe chatted about the incoming storm, but no one seemed to think it would be serious. Harold quietly listened, occasionally glancing at the cat with a faint sense of unease. Probably won't be able to come tomorrow, he thought. I might need to bring the muffin to the cat instead. By noon, the rain grew heavier and showed no signs of stopping. By evening, water began pooling on the lower streets. Alarms rang throughout the town as news spread that the old dam nearby had cracked. Residents quickly gathered their essential belongings and moved to higher ground. The once peaceful town now buzzed with the chaos of shouts, crying children, and the rushing sound of water. In his small house, Harold watched through the window, his worry mounting. He had lived through many storms but had never seen the water rise this quickly. As it began flooding the street outside, Harold knew he had to leave. But before he could go, another thought struck him: the cat. He remembered that morning, when the cat had been safely curled up at the cafe. Now, with the torrential rain, could the cat be trapped somewhere? Harold couldn't bear the thought. He quickly donned a raincoat, grabbed a flashlight, and stuffed a small bag with some muffins. I can't just leave it behind, he muttered, stepping out into the freezing water. The street outside had transformed into a shallow river. The icy water reached his knees, and Harold moved cautiously to maintain his balance. The houses around him were dark, their residents had already evacuated. The cafe was at the end of the street, and Harold knew he had to get there quickly. He called out as he walked, hoping his voice would attract the cat. But all he heard was the howling wind and the rush of water. When Harold reached the cafe, he saw the water had risen to the doorstep. Inside, the space was dark and cold. Harold stepped in, his flashlight beam sweeping over the overturned tables and chairs. He called out loudly, "Little friend, are you here?" His heart pounded as he feared he might be too late. But then, from a shadowy corner near the counter, Harold heard a faint meow. It was the cat. It was perched on a high chair, its fur soaked and its wide green eyes filled with fear. Harold felt a surge of relief so strong that tears welled up in his eyes. He approached slowly, gently picking up the cat and wrapping it in the towel he had brought. "It's okay now, I've got you," he whispered, comforting the trembling feline. Exiting the cafe, Harold knew they needed to find safety quickly. The water was rising faster, and the current grew stronger around his legs. Holding the cat tightly, Harold trudged through the icy floodwaters. Though his body ached, he didn't allow himself to stop. He knew their survival depended on his determination. At last, Harold saw the glow of a house on higher ground where some neighbors had gathered. They helped him climb up, and one woman quickly brought a dry towel to wrap the cat. Harold sat down, exhaling deeply in relief, knowing both he and the cat were safe. The cat, now dry and warm, curled up in Harold's lap, purring softly as if in gratitude. Sitting in the corner of the crowded room, Harold gazed out the window at the raging storm. He didn't know what tomorrow would bring, but he knew he had done the right thing. Harold's life had always been tied to small but meaningful acts. And tonight, with the gray and white cat in his arms, he realized that even in the face of disaster, connection and kindness were the most important things of all. The storm continued to rage throughout the night. And the floodwaters kept rising. The heavy rain drummed on the roof, blending with the howling wind outside, creating a tense atmosphere inside the temporary shelter. Harold sat by the window, his eyes fixed on the gray and white cat curled up in his lap. Though they were safe, his mind couldn't stop thinking about the lives still trapped outside, especially the small animals with no shelter. At dawn, the door opened, and George, Harold's neighbor, stepped in. George, a retired firefighter, had plenty of experience in emergencies. He wore an old cap and carried a rescue kit. Scanning the room, George's gaze landed on Harold. "Hey, old friend," George said, his voice steady but determined. "I've got a small boat ready outside. We need to do something, save people. Save animals. Will you come with me?" Without hesitation, Harold nodded. He gently set the cat down on a dry towel, stroking it before standing up. "I'm coming with you," Harold said, his eyes shining with resolve. He knew he couldn't just sit idly by. George's boat was a small inflatable raft equipped with oars and a few life vests. The two donned raincoats, helmets, and began paddling through streets that had turned into rivers. The icy water flowed swiftly, but George skillfully navigated the boat while Harold kept his eyes peeled for any signs of life. They weren't the only ones helping, other residents were also out, trying to assist their neighbors. Their first rescue mission brought them to a two-story house where a family was stranded on the roof. George and Harold guided the boat close, helping each member climb down and ferrying them to safety. On the way back, Harold spotted a small dog trembling on a second-floor balcony of another house. "Wait. I'll get it," Harold said. With George's help, he climbed up and carried the dog down. The dog shivered but didn't resist, as if it knew Harold was there to save it. They continued paddling through the flooded streets, rescuing several more cats, a pair of birds trapped in a cage, and even a white rabbit struggling to swim. Harold felt that each life they saved brought a glimmer of hope, not just for the animals, but for himself as well. Yet, in Harold's heart, one concern remained: the cafe cat. As they approached the cafe district, the water here was noticeably deeper. Harold's heart sank at the sight of his beloved cafe, now heavily damaged. Tables and chairs floated aimlessly, and the familiar brick walls were barely holding up. Scanning the area anxiously, Harold called out, "Little friend, where are you?" His voice echoed, carrying his worry. Then he heard it, a faint meow amidst the wind and water. Harold looked around until he spotted the gray and white cat perched atop a partially submerged car. It was soaked and trembling, its wide green eyes fixed on Harold. "There it is," Harold shouted to George. George paddled closer to the car, but the strong currents made it difficult to get near. "We need to be careful," George warned. But Harold was already moving. As the boat got as close as possible, Harold climbed out onto the car's roof. He extended his hand toward the cat, keeping his voice calm to reassure it. "It's okay, little friend. I'm here to get you." The cat, though frightened, seemed to recognize Harold and didn't resist. It allowed Harold to lift it up and hold it close. But as Harold prepared to return to the boat, a sudden gust of wind rocked the raft, sending water splashing everywhere. George yelled, "Hold on, Harold!" clutching the cat tightly. Harold steadied himself on the car roof. After a tense struggle against the wind and water, he managed to return to the boat with George's help. Both men were soaked and panting. But Harold's face lit up with a relieved smile. "I found it," he said, gently stroking the trembling cat in his arms. On their way back to safety, Harold kept his eyes on the cat, wrapping it in a dry towel and murmuring words of comfort. George, paddling from the rear, glanced at Harold and said, "You're a brave man, Harold. I've never seen anyone go to such lengths for an animal." Harold chuckled softly, his voice firm. "It's not just an animal, George. It's my friend." When they returned to the shelter, Harold was greeted with cheers and admiration. But for him, the most important thing was the cat in his arms, now safe and sound. As he looked at the lives they had saved, Harold felt his heart swell with gratitude. In the darkness of disaster, Harold realized that kindness and courage could light even the darkest moments. After the storm passed, the sky turned blue again. But the small riverside town looked entirely different. Streets once familiar were now covered in mud and debris. Many houses were damaged. Trees lay uprooted. And a somber atmosphere hung over the town. In his small home, Harold sat beside the gray and white cat he had rescued. The cat lay curled up on a dry towel Harold had prepared, its eyes still reflecting fear and unease. Harold understood that, like humans, animals needed time to recover from trauma. He gently placed a bowl of water and some soft food in front of the cat. "It's okay now, little friend. You're safe," Harold murmured, his warm voice adding a touch of comfort to the quiet room. The cat initially stayed still, its ears twitching slightly at Harold's voice. But after a while, it slowly got up, walked over to the bowl, and began to eat, nibbling cautiously. Harold smiled, relieved. He knew this small act signaled that the cat was beginning to feel secure. In the days that followed, Harold spent most of his time caring for the cat and cleaning his home, which had been invaded by mud and debris. The cat watched Harold from a distance, gradually sensing his patience and kindness. One day, as Harold sat down to rest, the cat approached him cautiously, eventually jumping onto his lap and curling up. Harold felt an indescribable warmth as he gently stroked its soft fur. He realized they had formed a special bond, one that required no words. Meanwhile, Harold's kind neighbor George continued his rescue efforts. George's home had become a temporary shelter for animals displaced or lost during the storm. The shelter housed all kinds of creatures: dogs, cats, rabbits, and even a few birds in a large cage. George and Harold worked with other volunteers to provide food, water, and a safe space for them all. Harold often brought his cat along when he visited George's shelter. And each time, the cat stayed close to Harold, unwilling to stray too far. "You know, Harold," George said one day as they fed the dogs, "I never thought we'd end up running a shelter like this. But seeing them safe and peaceful here, it feels worth it." Harold nodded in agreement. Every life, no matter how small, deserves a chance to live better. As time passed, the town slowly began to recover. But the bond between Harold and the cat grew stronger. Harold decided to name it Smokey, a name he felt suited its gray and white fur. Each morning, Smokey would sit by the door, waiting for Harold to finish preparing breakfast before hopping onto the table to join him. Harold always set aside a small portion of his muffin for Smokey, who seemed to relish it. Smokey became more than just a companion, it was a source of great comfort to Harold during these challenging days. Whenever Harold felt weary from the relentless work of cleaning and rebuilding, Smokey would climb into his lap, rubbing its head against his hand as if to remind him that he wasn't alone. These small gestures became a tremendous source of encouragement, helping Harold persevere through the toughest moments. Over time, Smokey became an inseparable part of Harold's life. It not only brought joy but also helped Harold connect more with the community. On their walks around the town, people often stopped to chat, asking about Smokey and Harold's rescue story. They praised Harold's bravery and kindness, leaving him feeling both bashful and deeply touched. One day, as Harold sat on his porch, watching Smokey play with a piece of string, he realized he had found new meaning in life. From a man who once lived quietly, he had become a protector and a friend to the small creatures in need. For Harold, Smokey was not just a cat but a symbol of hope and the profound connection between humans and nature. After the storm, the floodwaters slowly receded, leaving behind marks of devastation across the small riverside town. Streets once submerged were now dry but covered in mud and debris, serving as a stark reminder of the hardship everyone had endured. Damaged houses, fallen trees, and closed shops were scattered throughout the town. Yet, with mutual support, the townspeople began to rebuild their lives. A sense of unity filled the air as neighbors worked together to clean, repair, and restore the town from the ruins. Harold, too, resumed his daily routine. But this time, he was no longer alone. The gray and white cat, now named Buddy, had become an inseparable part of his life. Harold had considered returning Buddy to the cafe, the place it once called home. He thought the cafe might be a familiar and comforting space for Buddy, where the staff and regular patrons had cared for it. However, every time Harold thought about letting Buddy go, he felt an unexplainable emptiness. And each time he looked into Buddy's vivid green eyes, he knew the cat had already found its true home. Deciding to keep Buddy brought Harold a profound sense of relief and joy. Life with Buddy offered him unique comfort in the aftermath of hardship. Buddy seemed to understand that it had found a forever home. It followed Harold everywhere, from the backyard garden to the kitchen table where Harold prepared meals. Buddy often perched on the windowsill, watching the world outside with a serene demeanor, occasionally turning its head to check that Harold was nearby. A few weeks later, Harold's favorite cafe reopened. The familiar staff had cleaned and renovated the space, making it cozier than ever. When Harold stepped into the cafe for the first time since the storm, he felt a sense of familiarity and peace. He chose his usual table by the window, ordering a black coffee and his favorite muffin. But this time, he wasn't alone. Buddy leapt onto the chair beside him, curling up comfortably as if it, too, belonged there. The cafe staff quickly recognized Buddy and gathered around the cat with warm greetings. They shared how worried they had been during the storm and how happy they were to see that Buddy had found a home with Harold. "Buddy seems to have chosen you," Harold, one staff member remarked, placing a small bowl of water on the table for the cat. Harold chuckled, responding, "Perhaps. But honestly, I think I'm the luckier one to have Buddy." In the days that followed, Harold and Buddy established a new routine. Every morning, they visited the cafe together, where Harold enjoyed his coffee while Buddy lounged beside him, accepting gentle strokes from other patrons. Occasionally, Buddy would hop onto Harold's lap, sprawling out as Harold chatted with neighbors. Buddy had become a part of the cafe, just like Harold, but this time as a true companion. Life in the town gradually returned to normal. But for Harold, everything felt different. He no longer felt the loneliness that had once filled his days. Buddy wasn't just a cat, it was a friend, a family member, and an inspiration for Harold to embrace each day with newfound optimism. On tranquil mornings by the window, with sunlight streaming through the curtains, Harold and Buddy sat together, savoring the moment. Words were unnecessary, their presence alone was enough. One morning, as the sun rose, Harold sat by the window with his steaming cup of coffee, while Buddy curled up in his lap. The gentle sunlight bathed the room in warmth, bringing a peace Harold had never known before. Gazing out the window, Harold reflected on the journey they had been through, from the raging storm to the challenging recovery. He realized that not only the town but both he and Buddy had found a fresh start. Together, they had weathered the storm. And now, they were ready to face whatever lay ahead. Harold and Buddy's story ended in peace. A man and his small cat, sitting together by the window, embraced the sunlight after the storm, ready to begin a new day filled with hope.